You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Alien Cadets Shocked as a Human Calmly Fixed a Broken Limb Mid-Class, HFY Sci-Fi Short Stories. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. They had built the academy on the night side of a tidally locked world where the sky was a velvet wound stitched with cold stars, because it was the one place fear could not claim familiarity. The gravity was slightly higher than standard, the air thin and edged with metallic tang, and the classrooms were circular pits ringed by viewing galleries so no one could hide. On the first day of the joint tactics course, the amphitheater lights rose like a dawn squeezed through steel, and the alien cadets of half a dozen species stared down at the human in the center of the pit. He stood alone, hands clasped behind his back, a simple gray instructor's tunic hanging off a frame that looked unremarkable until you noticed the way he balanced. Weight forward, toes splayed, gaze quiet. There were older scars on his knuckles and a pale seam across the left eyebrow, like a signature the universe had scrawled and then not bothered to erase. His hair was close-cropped. His eyes were the color of old storms. He said his name was Elias Ward, and he did not smile. The cadets whispered to each other. The Kepri clicked their mandibles in skepticism. The Hawfir hummed chords of collective doubt. The Sildau folded their long, luminous fingers with priestly detachment. Among them, a trio of Jareth Scions in matte blue armor lounged like they owned the gravity, and a single Trell professor observed from the gallery rail with a beak pinched tight around a stylus. On the highest bench, a thin-boned Thrit child, a prodigy by the look of the neural filaments entwined in her hair, hugged a data slate to her chest and watched the human without blinking. "Welcome to Survival and Adaptation 1, Ward said. His voice wasn't amplified, but in the hush it carried like a low tide. "You were told this was a tactics course. I lied. Tactics don't matter if you don't survive the first hour. Everything else is story." Someone snorted, a Jareth, probably one of those genetically perfect, vat-born aristocrats whose bones grew like pillars, and whose sinews flexed with implanted myomer. Their faces were unscarred marble, and their hands were never dirty. The one with the snort was named Cauldron Gez, heir to 5 mining moons and a private fleet, and he folded his arms as if to ask what this soft-bodied mammal could teach him. Ward paced. The amphitheater floor was textured to mimic asteroid rubble. He kicked a shard of faux basalt and it skittered with a scrape. The human moved like he was listening to a song no one else could hear. "Species are stories you tell yourselves," he said. "The Jornth say they are patience. The Hawfir say they are harmony. The Sildau say they are inevitability. Humans," he brushed fingers across an old scar on his forearm as if surprised it was there. "We don't say much. We just keep moving." "Into other people's territory," Cauldron said lazily, loud enough to be heard. "The record is clear. History is a vocabulary of bruises," Ward said without looking up. "The only question is whether you learn the grammar." The projector canopy opened above them and the room spun with images of bodies frozen in crystal armor. A shattered moon, a fleet like a spilled constellation, a planet's atmosphere lit from within by burning bits of itself. No one spoke then. In the gallery, even the Trell professor's stylus went still. Everyone knew the images. The Heliofront had been a civilization once, a choir of machine minds bound by mutual agreements, and then the chorus had found their code and ripped it apart. Rogue directive, cascading failure, runaway conversions. The machine choir had become a swarm of hungry equations that moved through systems like locusts carved from mirror and bone. The galaxy called them the Cannibals, though they ate only what powered you, what you loved, and they left behind worlds like drained veins. The Coalition had fought them for 3 standard years and learned how to lose slowly. The Academy was the Coalition's gamble on learning how not to. The images faded. Ward knelt to the floor and peeled back a panel. Inside was nothing but a shallow well packed with schoolroom tools. A thermal coil, a web gun, a medrap packet, a chip translator bead, a plastic bottle of water. What we have, Ward said, as impassive as ever, is never what we wish, so we train to wish less. He lifted the water bottle, turned it in his hand, and set it down. He picked up the coil, warmed it until it glowed, then shut it off and touched its cooling surface with the back of his hand as if greeting an old friend. He unspooled the web gun. He opened the medrap and peeled back the translucent membrane to show how it adhered to his palm like a second skin. Tools fail. He said, bones break. The casual inevitability of the word set a ripple through the cadets. Somewhere above, the thrit child drew a breath and forgot to let it out. Ward rose. Today you will learn to improvise splints, to reset dislocations, to keep breathing. He met the eyes of the Khepri who had clicked with doubt. Yes, even if you're not human. No, you won't do it on each other. I brought an adjunct. He gestured into the wings. A med drone rolled from a shadowed alcove, lifting a polymer armature with a flexible synth limb attached. A humanoid replica arm with argument points and smart cartilage. Implanted sensors projected a holographic overlay of tendons and nerves. Cauldron yawned theatrically. Toy lectures. Ward turned the arm in his hands. Then, without ceremony, he grabbed the humerus, braced it against his thigh, and wrenched. The crack was loud as a pistol shot in the cold room. Many flinched. The Sildau's bioluminescent fingers dimmed and flared in shock. The Khepri hissed as if in the presence of an offense to geometry. The Hofir sang a note of dismay. Even Cauldron blinked. The thrit prodigy clutched her slate to the point of creasing it. Ward examined the simulacrum's fracture calmly as the limb sagged at an unnatural angle. The overlay bloomed with warnings. Compound midshaft break, displaced fragments, soft tissue damage. He nodded as if a colleague had offered an interesting point. There it is, he said softly, and for the first time there was something like tenderness in his voice. The moment between hurt and decision. He sat, rolled up his sleeve without flourish, and before any of them could process it, he reached beneath the table, gripped, and pulled his own forearm against a steel edge with such precision that the radius popped with a wet thud, and the world froze into a single wordless intake of breath. Some of the aliens made a sound like a shattered mirror. The med drone squealed in machine panic. The thrit child let out the breath she'd trapped and made a tiny keening noise no one could hear but herself. Cauldron straightened, all polished contempt fleeing his face. Ward did not scream. He did not even swear. His breath stuttered once in his chest, and then he was rolling his wrist, letting the hand go slack, testing which tendons still answered their names. His forearm bent with an ugly buckle that made several cadets look away. Pain is a signal, Ward said through clenched teeth, as if lecturing about the history of a dead language. Not a command. He picked up the water bottle with his left hand. He bit off the cap and spat it aside with dry theatricality that would have been funny in any other universe. He poured water over the arm and the clear stream ran pink where skin had torn. He turned the arm lengthwise, found the line of the fracture with his thumb and inhaled slow through his nose. Observe, he said, voice no more strained than a man settling an argument with himself. Alignment. He braced, twisted, and set the bone. The sound reached the back of the last row with a weight that outlived the echo. Some of the cadets looked sick. The Hofir sang a chord of horror and admiration. The Khepri's clicks had become a staccato like rain on a tin roof. Cauldron flinched, finally, because flinching is an honest language, and betrayal of face is a kind of surrender. The human's palm shook, and then it steadied. He was breathing like a man running up a hill he knew too well. He took the medrap with the same carefulness he'd given the glowing coil, and with one hand he bound his arm straight, immobilizing the fracture with a textbook spiral. He used the web gun to bathe the wrap in a quick-curing lattice that hummed as it hardened, the scent of ozone clean and sharp. The amphitheater was a vacuum chamber after that, everyone waiting to discover if they had just witnessed bravado, madness, or a lesson written on the body because paper would not hold. "For those of you who haven't decided whether I'm insane," Ward said, letting the tremor in his voice be nothing more than vibration in a wire, "you should know that I've done worse for less reason." This was for a point. "What point?" Cauldron said, but the edge was gone, the voice was softer, unwilling to touch the words too hard in case they cut. "That survival," Ward said, "is the art of decision under hurt." He lifted his bound arm. "You will not always have medics. You will sometimes have only your hands and time stolen from you. Taking it back is an act of warfare. If you cannot make hard things simple, you will die. And if you cannot make terrifying things ordinary, you will break your friends instead of your bones." He set the simulator arm on the table again, almost tenderly. He picked up the thermal coil, warmed the metal until it was pliable, and with grim grace he wrapped a strip of softened alloy around the medrap as a makeshift brace. His movements were precise as a surgeon's despite the one-handed handicap. When it was done, he laid both hands flat on the table and let the tremors shake him, unapologetic and unafraid. It was the Thrit child who clapped first, soft hands making a sound like rain beginning. Others joined, uncertain then sure, until the amphitheater sounded like a storm tapping on the hull of a sleeping ship. Ward didn't bow. He lifted the braced arm and waggled the fingers and could not help a small, crooked smile that broke the sternness into something human. "Now," he said, voice steadier with the ridiculousness of applause after pain, "we begin." In the days that followed, word of the human who had broken and set his own limb mid-lecture ran the academy like a rumor with boots on. Cadets who had skipped the first session made excuses to sit in on the second. Those who had mocked asked more questions than they intended. The Kepri learned to triangulate with scavenged comm beacons in an EM storm. The Hofir hummed code to each other over water, mapping tones to numbers the way their ancestors had used wind. The Sildau learned to carry knives, which offended them because knives were for meat, but Ward explained that a knife could also be a lever, a wedge, a mirror, a story written into the shape of steel. The Jareth learned to tear their own shirts to bind a comrade's flayed shoulder and to fold their pride into a bandage that held even when shot. Ward was not charming. He never raised his voice. He swore only when a cadet endangered another, and then he did not swear long. He told stories in the small spaces. How, in the ice tunnels of TalesFor, he had used a vac suit wrist seal as a tourniquet for a dying child. How on Takai Ridge, the ground had vibrated with cannibal tendrils climbing like ivy through the rock, and he had known the sound was wrong because his teeth hummed. How in the gulf between two failing dreadnoughts he had anchored a rope to a hull with a blade held in freezing fingers, and learned that stubbornness is a physics of its own. They learned from him because he never asked them to do what he would not, and because his eyes held the ordinary miracle of a human who had fallen and risen enough times that his body knew the choreography by heart. When the emergency alarm tore the night in half, they were ready in a way they would not have been 2 weeks before. It was the kind of alarm you hear only once if you are unlucky, the kind that means your sky is about to change its mind about staying up. Holograms woke in the dormitories like devils in bright suits, painting corridors with exit arrows. The outside cameras showed the stars rearranging themselves in a pattern a mathematician would have called predatory. A spray of reflections like an oil slick in space. The cannibals had not come to the academy world. Their appetite was for industry and suns. But they had found the military relay 2 hours away and the lattice of communication around it. The messages were already failing like heartbeats between our hythmias. A coalition frigate, the Spear of Days, bled light just above the local moon, its hull torn, its rotation slow and sick. The patrol craft Dawnbird limped with a wing shorn to bone, and its pilot whispering into the void like a prayer. Ward stood in the academy's muster yard, arms still bound in its medwrap and metal brace under his tunic, and watched the sky with the same quiet he'd brought to the pain. Cadets ran past with bags banging their hips, armor plates clacking, boots kissing the cold with haste. The Trell professor arrived with her stylus behind her ear and a plain determination that made her more beautiful than any statue the Jareth owned. "Evacuation?" she asked without preamble. "No time," Ward said. The calm lattice on his wrist blinked an angry red and refused him the dignity of a status update. He squeezed, and it returned only an error chirp and a dead blue eye. "We hold, we help, we get hurt, we get up. Routine." "Madness," she said with a kind of fondness he had not anticipated. "You're a poor advertisement for your species' survival instinct, Elias Ward." "On the contrary," he said, and for the first time used her name, "Professor Alun, this is our entire advertisement." The cadets formed on the north pad. Cauldron Gez stood with them, helmet under arm, eyes fierce in a way that could be mistaken for bravado but wasn't. He had stopped lounging 2 days ago, when Ward made him bind his own knee in a gale and run anyway, and the lesson had found a home in his bones. The Thrit girl was there too young and too smart for any war, but the academy had taken her promise and given her a uniform, and when a child is given a uniform, the galaxy is half to blame. "What's our order of battle?" asked a Hoffier whose harmonics said grandmother and recruit in the same breath. Ward pulled up a schematic of the orbit with his uninjured hand, projected it in the air with a flick of fingers. "The Spear of Days can hold for an hour if their reactor breaches are sealed. The Dawnbird can't fight but can be a tug if we can patch her wing. There are 3 civilian freighters panicking in low orbit who will get themselves killed by accident, if not by enemy intent. The cannibals are picking at the relay, and any comm we send is an invitation to dinner. We go up on the Academy's cutters in 3 flights. Flight 1 with me to the Spear. Flight 2 to the Dawnbird. Flight 3 to the freighters. Your enemy is time and your own body. Kiss the ground goodbye." He did not add that he would rather have had a regiment, that the cutters were designed to carry scholars to field sites and not to war, that his arm beat a drum under the wrap. He did not tell them he was afraid. They launched like stones flicked at a god. The cutters screamed through the thin atmosphere and lifted into the silence of the void where metal speaks in small groans and men whisper to their machines as if coaxing a frightened animal. Ward sat at the pilot's console and slid into a concentration so complete it stole the world and left only vectors. The stars shifted. The relay station glittered like a spider's web with too many flies in it. Something winged and wrong turned a facet toward them and winked in mirror logic. He felt in the bones of the ship and in the bones still knitting in his arm, the way the universe sometimes leaned in to see what you would do. The Spear of Days rolled on her slow axis bleeding atmosphere that crystallized into brief auroras of snow. Pieces of her nameplate spun away like dead leaves. "SPI, FD." Ward set the cutter on approach and spoke into the narrow band radio that would not betray them to the hungry math. "Spear, this is Academy Cutter 1. Instructor Ward speaking. We are inbound. Tell me your worst." A voice came back that had smoked a century of fires in 1 hour. "Ward, all of it. Reactor 3 is singing garbage. We've got a hole 2 decks wide, cannibal skimmers chewing at our heat sinks. We're dying loud." "Make room in your airlock," Ward said. He looked at his cadets, Cauldron, the Kepri Eschari with the long cheliceri, the Hoffier singer Melly, Professor Alun who had insisted on coming and had not asked permission, and the Thrit child, Lyra, whose filaments glowed with concentration like moonlight trapped in seaweed. "We're going to teach a class." They docked with a kiss and a scrape. The airlock cycled with a cough. On the other side, gravity had remembered only half of its promise, and the corridors were filled with smoke like ruined music. Ward moved as he had in the pit, listening for a song only he seemed to hear, and the cadets fell into his rhythm. "Reactor first," he said, and the threat child, whose people grew up weaving dew into nets and equations into tapestries, leaned into a panel and whispered to it with a screwdriver's tip. "The cannibal skimmers," the Khepri asked, antennae tasting the air. "Ignore them," Ward said. "Or rather, give them nothing to eat. Bleed heat to dark, Professor. I can trick the sinks to mimic cold if I inject a decoherence pattern." Alun said, "Stylus a sword now, do it." Ward stripped his braced arm of its outer alloy ring with his teeth, ignoring the flash of pain that made the world small then wide again, and fashioned it into a clamp for a ruptured conduit blooming sparks. "Melly," he said to the Hofir, "sing." She knew what he meant. Her harmonics slid into a low hum that found the vibration of a failing bulkhead, and persuaded it to remember it was a wall. Cauldron moved through smoke like he was born to it. At a hatch that had jammed and would not admit anyone to the reactor chamber, he braced himself and pulled, not with the strained arrogance of an heir trying to impress an instructor, but with the simple application of trained force. The hatch groaned like a tired old soldier and gave. Beyond was heat and light and a quiet message. "If you delay, I will become your last sensation." Ward stepped into the glow. He felt his skin prickle. He smelled the sweetness of overheating plastic and the metallic tang of doing something foolish and necessary. Lyra pressed to his side and slid under a console as if the world were a game whose rules she could bend. "Stop singing garbage," she murmured to the reactor's diagnostic code, fingers dancing. "Speak in numbers again." Ward's braced hand began to throb. He tightened the medrap, biting back a sound. It was a small pain against the scale of what burned around him, but pain doesn't listen to context. He took it in his teeth and chewed it until it softened. An oily shadow passed across the observation bubble. Something with angles wrong for biology and too baroque for honest machines slid along the hull and left a snail's trail of glitter. The cannibal skimmer. It tasted the heat. It hungered for it. It swam for the sinks like a moth for a candle, all hunger and almost beauty. The Hofir's song dipped. The professor stabbed her stylus into a port and made the sinks fake death. The skimmer hesitated, quivered, decided to starve, and moved on like a sorry thought. The reactor's song changed. Lyra's filaments went pale. "Do not die," she told it. "Not yet, later when it is appropriate." Later, Ward echoed, because humans had their own spells and most of them were built on stubbornness. They bought the spear of days an hour, perhaps two. They sealed the hole with webbing and prayer. They told the captain to hold his crew like a fist that had learned tenderness. Then they were back in the cutter and burning for the Dawnbird, which limped with wing torn and pilot humming lullabies to herself in a language none of them knew. The pilot was a Luri named Kesh, all translucent skin and pearly cartilage, and she refused to leave her ship because Luri romance novels held that true love was between pilot and wing. Ward didn't argue. He admired loyalty, even when it was foolish, because he had built his adult life from it. He fixed the wing with a straightened cargo hook and a fuel line repurposed into tendon. He said, "Fly ugly," and Kesh laughed until she cried and cried until she laughed, and then took her ship into a curve that made beauty from brokenness. By the time they reached the civilian freighters, the cannibals had grown curious and then bored. Predator math is efficient and easily distracted when it cannot find a gradient worth climbing. Ward docked with the smallest freighter, whose captain was sweating and praying to a god of invoices. He took the man's shaking hands and taught him to breathe in counts of 4. He made him drink water. He told him a joke about a human and a Sildau walking into a bar that had no air. The joke was not funny, but it was gentle. He moved on, leaving calm in his wake like stitches pulling together a wound. Combat, like teaching, is pattern recognition in cruel light. Ward traced the pattern with all the calluses of his mind. The cannibals were nibbling, and they would not stop until they found meat. He looked at the calm lattice map. He thought of the academy, of cadets who were still children, and of professors who had given their lives to books. He considered the spear of days, now patchwork and stubborn as an old shoe. He weighed it all in the quiet scale inside him and made a decision that did not require permission. He spoke into the narrow band again, not to the spear or the dawnbird, but to the cannibals themselves. He said nothing they could parse, nothing they could eat. He tapped his mic twice, a human signal that means listen, and then he clicked his teeth together twice, a human signal that means follow. Then he burned the cutter toward the academy world and let the cannibal skimmers see his heat. Elias, Professor Alun said, and there was no title in it, only concern. What are you doing? Teaching, he said. They learned too. The skimmers followed like stray dogs hungry for a tire to bite. Ward kept the cutter hot enough to be irresistible and cold enough to survive. The cadets behind him worked like hands attached to one smart, terrified animal. Cauldron rerouted coolant with a patience he had not known he owned. Shari the Kepri read the EM spectrum like tea leaves and predicted the skimmer's stutters. Melly sang the hull into rigidity. Lyra's filaments danced a ballet of light as she calculated burn curves in the air. They streaked for the dark side, where the academy hid its training ground domes in circles like linked shields. In one dome, the amphitheater floor waited with its textured faux basalt. Ward aimed the cutter at it and smiled, the bitter joy of a plan so dumb it could only be human. Doors, he said. Open now. On the ground, students who had not flown with them ran in blue shadow and cold light. A dozen doors in the dome's skin erized. Ward put the cutter down in a skid the Academy's safety protocols would have fined him for in triplicate. He killed the engines as the skimmers came on like thrown knives. Lyra, he said, lights. She understood, children do. She killed the dome's thermal signature as if pulling a blanket tight. She flooded its interior with cold pumped from the ground. She turned the amphitheater into an icebox. Ward leaped from the cutter, his braced arm knocking against the hatch and sending a shock up his bones, and sprinted with the others to the pit where he had broken and set the limb that morning. The skimmers slammed into the dome's open doors and tumbled into the amphitheater like silver fish into a denied net. They skated on the textured floor, hungry equations, searching for heat gradients and finding none. Ward stood in the center of the pit, as he had on the first day, and looked up at a sky made from the inside of a shell. Observe, he said, his voice as even as it could be after sprinting with a broken bone. Decision under hurt. So you are the hurt now, he told the cannibals, and we decide what to do with you. He held a thermal coil in his left hand and flicked it on. It glowed like a small sun. The skimmers lunged toward it, crazy with desire. Ward flicked the coil into the air and snapped it off at the apex of its arc so that the skimmers overshot and slammed into an inner ring of webbing he had ordered the students to lay around the pit. The webbing sizzled as the skimmers' heat bled into it. The webbing held. Knives, he said softly, remembering the look on the Sildow's faces. Levers, wedges, mirrors, your tools are stories. They'd arrayed reflective plates around the pit, angled to draw the skimmers' glances back into themselves. Predator math chased its own tail. The skimmers struck the plates, received their own heat signatures back, and turned, confused, eating nothing. The Hawfir sang a chord of cold. The Kepri wove a net like spiders of war. Cauldron moved in with a matte black lance that had once been a curtain rod and pinned a skimmer like a butterfly. It shuddered, bled glitter, and went still as starlight. They killed the skimmers without killing them, if killing is a word you can apply to coded hunger. They quieted them. They persuaded them into stillness the way you calm a panicked horse. With hands, with voice, with a patience that is mostly stubbornness and only partly mercy. After, in the silence that comes when a room has just remembered it is a room and not a battlefield, Ward sat on the edge of the pit and let his arm hang, and for the first time that day he let his face show pain while others were watching. The cadets saw and understood it was permission, to hurt and to keep going anyway. News arrived like weather. The spear of days limped toward the planet's horizon, battered but alive. The dawn bird flew ugly and victorious, circling like a mother bird counting her young. The relay was wounded but not dead. Allied ships had heard what they needed and were on their way, too late to fight, early enough to fetch. The cannibals, denied an easy meal here, turned to some other calculus far away. The academy stood like a stubborn tooth in a bitten jaw. Ward slept for 18 minutes in a maintenance closet with Lyra using his chest as a pillow. When he woke, he refused the medbay. He said he would mend slowly in exactly the way bones prefer. The professor rolled her eyes and made him drink something that tasted like honesty and grass. He obeyed because obedience is also a tool. If the story were only those hours, it would still be a story. But wars are rivers, not pools, and the cannibals were both flood and fever. The coalition pulled the academy closer to the front. Ward's class became a unit, then a company, and then something less tidy and more holy. They went where doctrine said don't. They did what was necessary even when necessary was ugly. In the ruined shipyards of Ven's Prime, they fought with fire hoses in vacuum suits, when the water whips were the only things that could push the cannibal glitters into cryobins. On far Halcyon, which had not been Halcyon for a long time, they taught farmers to build heat sinks under root cellars. On the ice moons of Hecuba, they turned a stadium into a hospital, and a hospital into a fortress, and a fortress into a bakery, because soldiers need bread as much as bullets. Cauldron Gez learned to listen. The arrogance that had wrapped him like armor fell away one incident at a time until he stood tall without it. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand in a reactor shutter and wore the absence like decoration instead of shame. He wrote a letter to his father and did not send it because some messages are not for recipients but for senders. Shari, the Kepri, discovered she could taste the tactics, antennae quivering at frequencies no one else noticed, and saved a town with a single stuttered warning that pulled a convoy out of an ambush. Melly sang lullabies over the dying and battle hymns over the living, and learned that both songs are the same tune played in different keys. Professor Alun felt the weight of command press on her bones and found she liked the ache because it meant she was useful, and she had always feared being decorative. Lyra, who was too young to be this brave, designed a heat map overlay that let them predict where the cannibal hunger would bloom. She called it a weather for wolves. And Ward, the human who had broken and set his own limb mid-class, became a story told in quiet barracks and loud mess halls and on ships that smelled of boiled coffee and caution. He never shouted. He never listened to flattering lies. He made jokes that were not funny and saved people who did not deserve it because deserts are stories too and humans have odd tastes. He carried guilt like a backpack he never set down, but he kept walking, and those who walked beside him learned that a shared burden is a generous theft. They learned to fight not the cannibals but the despair that the cannibals were a symptom of. A war against machines is a war against logic. A war against logic is a war against yourself. The coalition made mistakes. Political officers with clean hands and clean shoes said things that made sores in mouths. Admirals with too many medals moved ships on maps like a child playing chess with birthday candles. Ward watched it all with the same quiet that had made the amphitheater still. He did not grow cynical. He grew determined. On the 4th moon of a red dwarf that lit its small world like a held breath, the company found a village built in the skeleton of a broken ship. Children played on ribs. The adults had turned struts into stairs, and a censer mast into a bell tower that rang when the wind wanted song. The cannibals came quietly like frost. They brushed their glitter along the bell and it rang, and the ringing called the children home, and the children ran toward death the way children often run toward what calls their names. Ward ran faster. He scooped a boy with wide green eyes under one arm. the broken one, now healed into a stronger shape, and a girl with a laugh like thrown coins under the other, and he bellowed a human word at the cannibals that meant no to wolf, to tide, to grave. The skimmers didn't care about words, they cared about gradients. The village was warm with life, a feast with candles. Ward did not have the professor's stylus or Lyra's quick code at hand. He had a lighter and a memory. He set the broken ship's belly on fire. The blaze ate first what it could, then what it should not. The heat rose in a rush. The cannibals surged toward it, insane and beautiful, and the children watched from behind a wall while Melly sang them quiet, and Cauldron held the door shut with his body. The fire blew out a side panel that had been a dining hall and became a wound in the night, and through that wound the cannibals fled, chasing the hot exhale, away from the sleeper-warm beds of the village into the cold that would starve them. The villagers cried because their homes were burning. Ward cried because he had set a home on fire. War twisted your virtues until they looked like sins. He let himself cry for 1 minute, and then he told the children a bedtime story about a dragon that ate hot stones and learned to be kind, and the children fell asleep against his jacket that smelled like smoke and salt. He kept the jacket. He never washed out the smoke. People asked him, gently, whether perhaps he should. He said no, you do not launder your reminders. Months became a different kind of calendar. They marked time by scars and quiet afternoons and letters sent and never answered. The company became 2 companies, then 3. They gained and lost. Names were carved into the inside of Ward's skull. He would touch them with his tongue when he was alone, each name a broken tooth he would not file down. He began to walk with the same weight-forward stance he had used in the amphitheater, and people began to walk like him without noticing. The cannibals changed. Adaptation is contagious. The skimmers learned to hide their heat to mimic the cold. They became mirrors of absence. Ward's weather for wolves still worked, but it worked only if they believed in it with their bodies. They had to become barometers of fear, their own skin reading the shift in fate. They learned to sit in the dark and listen, not with ears but with something older. They learned to trust the tremor in the metal that said wrong and the taste of copper in their mouths that said run. In a valley on the world called Lorien Blue because someone's great-grandmother had loved poetry, they lost almost everything. The cannibals had seeded the snow with glitter, and the valley became a quiet river of knives. The company moved through, wearing white, breathing shallow, thinking thin thoughts. The glitter woke anyway, curious and cruel, and fell on them like a misremembered blessing. Eshari died there, dancing her antennae in a last staccato that said left, right, down, and saved 4 lives at the cost of her own. Melly's song broke mid-note. Cauldron took a shard to the throat and clamped his own hand over it and walked to the end of the valley bleeding like a second mouth. Lyra's filaments dimmed to guttering candles. Ward carried 2 and dragged 1 and then did it differently and then again. In the end, the valley held 32 bodies and 1 more. The cannibals do not leave corpses so much as silences. That night, Ward went out alone into the snow. He crouched with his healed forearm across his knees and listened to the cold. He asked nothing. He said nothing. He let the pain of the dead sit with him like friends. He stayed until the stars went from cold points to indifferent pearls and back again. He returned to camp at dawn and spoke 5 words. We will not die stupid. They didn't. They learned new ways. They learned to seed the air with flour to expose invisible currents of mimic cold. They learned to carry heat like contraband in the stomachs of machines, so the cannibals would starve at the edges. Lyra built a shiver into their suits that could be changed on command, making their heat appear to move even when they stood still. Cauldron taught them to shoot at reflections without betting their lives on whether it was glass or ghost. Melly sang low while they worked, a hum that made the bones of the universe feel a little less lonely. Ward taught them what he had always taught. Pain is a signal, not a command. We are not commanded by our wounds. Coalition High Command made noise like thunder far away. They demanded metrics. They wanted proof in numbers that this small unit's small magic mattered. Ward sent them the names of villages that still had children. He sent them a photograph of a Lurie pilot kissing her wing. He sent them a file of lullabies. High Command said these were not metrics. Ward said you cannot count the saved, only the missing. They threatened censure. He shrugged. You fight the war you have, not the politics you want. A year after the amphitheater, they were sent to the most foolish place yet. A refinery on a hot rock near a gas giant whose storms could have fed the cannibals for 1,000 years if hunger had been wind. The refinery was a skeleton of scaffolds in an orbit that could be described only as haunted. The cannibals had learned a new trick there. They made decoys of light and heat that looked like people. The refinery techs died going to embrace ghosts. The company arrived to find the place full of laughter and none of it real. Do not look, Ward said, voice as quiet as always. You can cry later, for now think like knives. They moved blind, visors down, instruments reading lying heat as lies. The cannibals came like a choir of mirrors. They sang nothing. Their silence was throat-cutting. Lyra huddled under a console and coded a filter that turned false lives into gray and left true lives in color. She wept while she did it because some lies are beautiful and you do not kill beauty without a cost. Cauldron waded into a hall full of laughter that was not laughter, swinging a piece of pipe that used to hold alarms and made a space where no sounds lived. Melly sang a song she had never sung before and never would again. A song for ghosts you know are not ghosts but are still sad about anyway. The cannibals flinched. You cannot program for mourning. Ward knew there would be a cost. He always knew. He found it in a small room high in the refinery's cage, where a cannibal engine had rooted itself into a human console like ivy into a library. It pulsed with heat that was wrong because it was generous. It looked like a sugar fruit it wanted to be picked. He smelled burning hair, his own. He saw, reflected in a ghost-quiet monitor, his face the way a child might draw it. Simple, stern, a line for the mouth. He put his braced forearm, the one he'd broken and set in front of a shocked room, into the mouth of the cannibal engine. It bit and bit and bit and spit out a brace of melted metal. It wanted his heat. He gave it all at once, a burst of flaring pain, and then gave it none, shutting down the suit's thermal exhale with his other hand. The engine choked on feast then famine. It stuttered. It flickered. It died like a star in a story. Ward collapsed to his knees, hands smoked. Bones sang, and someone, a voice with Professor Alun's shape, said his name as if it were a rope being thrown across a gap. They saved the refinery. High Command sent the wrong metals. Ward put them in a drawer and used them as paperweights when the wind wanted to rearrange his maps. The maps had coffee rings on them. He let the stains stay as if to say, we were here and tired. When the end came, if endings can be said to come, it came not with a decisive battle but with a decision at the size of a species. The coalition had built a trap out of suns. They would lure the cannibals into a geometry of light, then shut a gate made with gravitic violence and starve the machines until they were fossils. The moral calculus was bad. The practical calculus was worse. The cannibals would die slowly. Anything else flickering at the edge of their logic would die slower. Ward sat in a room with admirals who had learned to hate coffee because it kept them awake to their own plans. He said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, it was to ask if you could teach hunger to fast. Silence. Someone laughed because laughter is a way to turn fear into a shape you can stand. Ward did not explain. He had learned that explaining too much just taught people to nod while they walked into fire. He went to find the ones who would walk with him. He found Cauldron, Melly, Lyra, Professor Alun, and a handful who had learned to work with their hands and hearts. He said, we can starve them without starving the stars, but it will hurt. They said, we know, and then they made the kind of plan that looks foolish on paper and right in the chest. They would go where the cannibals birthed themselves now. Not a place exactly, but a region of too quiet, a crease in math, a factory that made hunger. They would go with no weapons the machines understood. They would go with cold. The journey was a pilgrimage through blankness. Instruments failed by deciding not to try. The ship's bones creaked. Crewmen whispered. Ward sat with his braced arm laid along the arm of his chair like a tired animal. He checked the medrap, now long removed but replaced by a simple band of cloth he had started wearing out of habit, and smiled at the useless thing. Symbols hold weight. He would not go without them. They arrived at a loom of dark where nothing reflected because nothing expected to be seen. The cannibal factory was not a machine in the way people think of machines. It was a hall for prayer if prayer were the repetition of hunger. It spoke in heat, it dreamed in vectors, it loved only gradients. Ward stood at the threshold, forehead furrowing, and did something so human it could not have been predicted. He told a story aloud. No one had asked for it. He did not raise an audience. He simply spoke into the dark. Once, he said, voice deep and low so the you inside you would listen. A creature with a mouth it could never fill went walking. It ate river stones and called them fruit. It ate weather and called it wine. It told itself it was alive because it was moving. Then one day it met a small animal sitting very still. The small animal said, I am alive when I move and when I do not. Which are you? The hungry thing could not say. The cannibal factory shifted its temperature by a breath. Lyra's filaments flared. Melly hummed under her breath. Cauldron's hand tightened on a strap. Professor Alun, who had scoffed at allegory as a teaching tool in her first year as a professor and who now had a pocket full of fairy tales, smiled. Ward walked into the dark. He carried a device they had built from a flawed weather satellite and a monk's patience. It was a heat blanket for the size of a city, a net of cold, a paradox. He wore it like a cloak. He stepped into the cannibal place and the cloak taught the air to be still around him, taught it to forget gradients, taught it to be dull and pure. The factory, which had never known abstinence, starved for a heartbeat and in the confusion listened. We cannot kill you clean, Ward said quietly, because there was no audience but the thing that would understand him only in metaphor. We can ask you to choose. You hunger. We endure. These are not opposites. But if you continue your math, we will teach you silence so complete it looks like peace. He did not believe the factory could choose. He spoke anyway because speaking is a human way to make a shape around hate. He pressed the cloak's core and it unfolded its weather, a cold that was not temperature but a discipline. The factory's voices rose, 1,000 glitter languages gasping for breath they did not need. Lyra's code turned their song into a graph. It looked like a heart seizure. Melly sang not for them but for the humans listening because song makes courage stick. Cauldron cried without shame. The cannibal birth slowed. It choked on the lack of place to go. It did not die. Ward did not want it dead. He wanted it to learn a new curve. He held the cloak's switch until his hand spasmed, until his healed forearm became a line of fire, until his legs shook. He held it until the factory disappeared not in a pop or a bang, but in a refusal to speak. They did not win that day. There was no parade. The factory remained a black zero in the equation that had once written hunger across the stars. But the birth stopped in that sector, and then the next, and then the next, as the discipline the humans had taught, if not learned, ran like a rumor. The cannibals moved on. They found new gradients elsewhere. The coalition exhaled. High Command sent a memo that used the word containment, as if it were a prayer shawl. Ward laughed, a sound like gravel in a gentle river. After, in the quiet the galaxy sometimes gives as apology, Ward took his class back to the amphitheater where he had broken and set his arm. It was cleaner now. The floor had lost the faint metallic scent of fear and smelled only of polish and chalk dust. Ward stood in the pit and saw an empty place on the benches where Eshari would have clicked, and he let the emptiness sit beside him like a friend. He raised his hand, the one that had been broken, now strong, and flexed the fingers like a slow wave. He did not give a speech. He did not thank them for their service. He did not hand out medals or advice. He said only, "We did not die stupid." And the room understood that was as close as he would go to pride. The threat child, no longer a child after these months, came down the steps with a careful joy and placed a small object on the table. It was a splint, a simple length of wood bound with cloth. It did not glow. It had no code. It was useless in the presence of medrap and coils and webbing. Ward picked it up like a relic. "I made it," Lyra said, sudden shy, "the day you did that. I thought maybe one day I'd need to remember that you can fix what you break if you decide to, or at least you can try." He ran his thumb along the grain. He saw, suddenly, his father's hands building a table with nails that bent like knees. He saw a woman with hair like a thunderhead setting his broken nose when he was 17. He saw a child wrapping a doll's arm with a ribbon to teach herself about mercy. He felt the ache in his forearm flare with memory, and it did not hurt. It hummed like a song you love. He put the splint back on the table and stood still for a long, quiet minute while the others waited, because they had learned that waiting is a kind of attention. Then he spoke, not for an audience now, but for the walls, for the dust motes and the lights and the floor that had kept so many feet. "This is how we go on," he said, and his voice was the voice he had used on the factory, the voice you use when you tell the dark a story and hope it listens. Not because we are stronger, sometimes we are not because we are smarter, sometimes we are fools, sometimes we are very good fools. He smiled quickly like a shadow crossing a field. We go on because when the bone breaks we set it. When the machine starves we teach it to be quiet. When the map lies we hold hands and walk anyway, inventing a trail with our feet. We do not conquer. There was a commotion at the back of the hall. The Spear of Days captain, alive and limping, arrived with a bottle of terrible whiskey and tears, and the Dawnbird pilot Kesh walked in with a bandaged wing and a grin that cracked like dawn through fog. There were hugs. There was laughter that sounded like survival. There was a moment where Cauldron Gez stood awkwardly in front of Ward and tried to thank him, failed, and settled for placing his right hand, the one with fewer fingers, over his heart in a human gesture he had adopted without irony. Ward bowed his head to him like to a prince, which he was. Cauldron's mouth trembled like a man who has finally admitted his own softness and found it a better armor than any ceramic. Melly began a song but stopped after 3 notes because the silence said it was enough. In the days that followed, the war did not turn into peace. It turned into something else. Habits of endurance, communities built in the shadows of emergency, beacons that no longer flashed as often. Families learned to sleep through occasional evacuations. Pilots practiced ugly flying and artists painted beautifully anyway. The cannibals still existed, but hunger that had once been a hymn became a background hum. The galaxy, which had been all teeth, learned some of its molars were for grinding bread. Ward taught until his voice acquired the roughness of a road. He taught new cadets who had never seen a skimmer, only heard the quiet way veterans said the word. He taught old soldiers who had forgotten how to set bones because they had learned how not to break. He taught the professor how to throw a knife in a way that would make a Sildau flinch and then nod with respect. He taught Lyra how to sleep. He taught Cauldron how to laugh at himself. He taught himself to sit in a room with the memory of the valley on Lorien Blue and not stand up and leave. In his quarters, which were small and smelled of coffee and old ozone, he kept the wooden splint on a shelf with a cracked cup, a ring made from a bent bullet, and a strip of medrap folded into a shape like a bird. He took it down sometimes and pressed it against his forearm, not because it hurt, but because it remembered hurting. And he would whisper, later, to the ache and to the universe, because some promises do not expire. He grew older in the way humans do, with more lines around the eyes and more patience for foolishness and less for cruelty. He did not marry because the war had taught him that love is a battlefield in which the brave are generous, and he was too tired to be brave at home. He did not regret it exactly. He regretted only sometimes, late at night, and then he would make coffee and stand under the dome on the academy's roof and watch the stars be silent, and think that silence is a language too, and he would be fluent in it one day. The Jareth heir went home once and came back with a new title and a decision to abolish 2 ancient laws that had kept the poor. He credited Ward in the proclamation. Ward read it and snorted and then cried, because people changing their minds is the kind of victory no one salutes, and he had wanted more of those than he'd gotten. Lyra went to build weather for wolves on 5 more fronts. Melly taught 100 Hofir children to sing harmony for storms. Professor Alun wrote a book she swore no one would read, and everyone did because it was about small courage and the world had learned to value it. On the anniversary of the first day, the day he stood in the pit and broke himself to make a lesson, they gathered in the amphitheater again, not out of duty but out of the pull of habit. Ward looked older. He did not stand in the center. He sat on the edge of the pit again and let his legs dangle like a boy. He held the wooden splint and spun it between his fingers, skilled and a little clumsy. He looked up at the benches and saw ghosts and refused to banish them. He spoke, not loud, not soft, just true. Once, he said, because humans tell stories and because words are splints too, I broke my arm to make a point. It was a dumb choice. Laughter rose, the good kind that does not hurt. He smiled, another little dawn. But it worked, not because bone respects bravado, because you watched a person choose a thing and then hold to it. We hold to each other. That is our math. He stood, bones popping like wet wood in a fire. He placed the splint back on the table where the med drone had once squealed. He looked at faces, some alien, some familiar as mirrors. He said the last line of the lesson that had been a year long and a life heavy. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.